Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. Joining me is Andrew Cockburn. He is the Washington editor for Harper's magazine, and his latest book is Spoils of War. Andrew, thank you for joining me.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
We are in the midst of this crisis over Ukraine, and one of Democrats' major priorities is pushing through more weapons sales to Ukraine. And I was curious to get your perspective on what role the weapons industry has played in the current crisis. Can you talk about that and how this major issue that Russia has wanting to keep Ukraine out of NATO, how NATO expansion has been a boon for the weapons industry that you've spent so much time covering?
Absolutely. Well, actually, I'm continually reminded, I remind myself of a story that's in the book, In Spoils of War, which describes a meeting held by the chairman of the House, one of the House military committees, actually it was the Intelligence Committee, a fundraising breakfast a couple of days after Putin, Russia took over Crimea. And there were a group of, it was mostly attended by defense industry lobbyists. And there was a friend of mine who was also a lobbyist who was present, and I saw him later that day, and he was telling me about this meeting, and I said, "Well, how did it go? What was the mood?" And he said, "I'd call it borderline euphoric." They were all so excited at this, the incredible possibilities have been opened up. That now, with Russia moving into Crimea, that obviously, the new Cold War could really ramp up, and so it's proved. I know you've talked a lot about Russiagate and the absurdity of the Trump impeachment, the first Trump impeachment inquiry. And I always like to remind people that the Democrats impeached Trump for holding up a weapons sale. That was his major crime, for holding up a Raytheon weapons sale. And that is, it's a great reflection on the today's political culture that's considered an indictable offense.
Well, look, someone watching this might say, no, the real offense was that Trump held up the weapons sales and tried to use that to pressure Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. And what I spent a lot of time writing on at the time for The Nation magazine was that while it's true that there was evidence that that Trump and Giuliani mainly Giuliani were applying pressure on Ukraine to launch some kind of probe of Biden and Hunter Biden's dealings and getting that very lucrative job at Burisma and Biden's role in firing the prosecutor, they had no evidence at all that this pressure campaign by Giuliani was connected to this weapons freeze. And the weapons freeze only happened because after Trump came into office, he was constantly being called a Russian puppet. And so to, I think, help prove that he wasn't, he undid Obama's decision, which was to reject those weapons sales, and he approved them. Then finally, when he paused them, he had been complaining about how much the U.S. is paying for them and subsidizing these weapons for Ukraine, and he wanted NATO to pay more. And there's plenty of evidence of that. And there's no evidence at all that somehow his pressure campaign about Biden was connected to this weapons freeze. And because of the lack of evidence, that's when Democrats pivoted to relentlessly saying that Trump had put the U.S. in danger because he had frozen these weapons sales. And the famous saying of Schiff,
"The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here."
I know there were so many inane statements associated with this whole business, but I think that's probably the lead one. I mean, there was a friend of mine who I quote often in the book, who was a great inspiration to me on all this thing, Pierre Spray, who unfortunately passed away last year. And he, who was the clearest-eyed observer or inmate, indeed, for many years of the Pentagon I've ever met. And he
designed a major warplane, right?
He designed the A-10. Well, had designed the A-10, created the A-10, or co-created it with someone else, and the F-16. The only two rare instances of weapons that actually work in our armory. But Pierre always used to say that the U.S. government basically has two functions, which are to buy arms at home and sell arms abroad, and that's what it does. I'm always impatient. I mean, I've written elsewhere, and I talk a bit in the book about, certainly in the introduction, about how futile it is to talk about foreign policy. I mean, the idea that sort of nations have this, collective impulse to do things with regard to the rest of the world. It's not. It's almost always to do with money, and usually, and personal interest and personal political ambitions. And usually, certainly in our case, it has to do with arms sales. Our whole approach to China at the moment has a lot to do with arms sales to Taiwan. Certainly, our approach to Europe and the expansion of NATO had again, I talk about this a lot in the book, had a lot to do with the ambitions of the Lockheed Martin Corporation and Norm Augustyn's need to find a market for F-16s in Eastern Europe. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union, that's what explains it. And I think, assuming we all survive the current lunacy, I mean, future historians, I think, will, disinterring the Ukraine crisis of 2022, we'll see we'll discern the hand of Raytheon, Lockheed, General Dynamics. That's what it's clearly to me all about in the end.
Speaking of Lockheed Martin, let me read to you a lead from a New York Times article from 1997. This was when the Senate was considering approving a major expansion of NATO, which it did with very little opposition. So this is from the lead of the article. The article is by Jeff Girth and Tim Weiner. At night, Bruce Jackson is president of the U.S. Committee to Expand NATO, giving intimate dinners for senators and foreign officials. By day, he is director of strategic planning for Lockheed Martin, the world's biggest weapons maker. Mr. Jackson says he keeps his two identities separate, but his company and his lobbying group are fighting the same battle. Defense contractors are acting like globe-hopping diplomats to encourage the expansion of NATO, which will create a huge market for their wares. That's from the New York Times in 1997. Now, Andrew, you interviewed Bruce Jackson for your reporting. Can you talk to us about what his group was, who was a part of it, and that period of, a lobbying frenzy to expand NATO back in the 1990s?
Well, yeah, I mean, Bruce, we had many conversations, and he would insist with an absolutely level voice and straight face that really, his day job with Lockheed and his nighttime, wine drinking parties were completely disassociated. In fact, I think he tried to tell me one time that Lockheed rather disapproved of his energetic activities in expanding NATO. And I was slightly insulted that he expected me to believe this nonsense. But what was interesting about the group was they met, and you've actually looked at this more recently than I have, I'm ashamed to admit, but the copy of my book is actually propping up my laptop as we speak, so I can't refer back to it. But it was a group. It was a very bipartisan group. There was the guy who'd been Clinton's lawyer. There was a sort of Republican, sort of mainstream Republican socialite. They would have in. They would invite in, sort of, as they sat over this rich lady's wine and cheese, they would invite in, veterans of the fight against communism in Eastern Europe in the days of the Soviet Union, who would talk about how they'd been, sort of tortured and harassed by the KGB, and they would invite along, they would have, 6-10 senators sitting around the fire discussing how to do this. And it was, it built up this, I mean, the important thing to me, it seems to me, about this whole push, rearmament push, reigniting the Cold War that went on and has gone on successfully, I'm afraid, is how bipartisan it is. Bruce kept stressing to me, it was Democrats involved. This was a wholly bipartisan initiative. And we're seeing that today with, the activities of the Democrats in Congress. But, in sort of, now we can read, any number of analyses of NATO expansion, but you so rarely see the name Norm Augustyn mentioned, and who was this extremely crafty and smart head of Lockheed Martin, and the role he played, his closeness to Clinton, his employment of Bruce Jackson, who, by the way, Bruce later on, slightly later, founded the committee. It was the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq, and there was the Committee on the Transitional Democracies. Bruce eventually actually got religion, and again, a story in the book, which is, we should mention the events in Georgia in 2008, when it was really a precursor to the present crisis over Ukraine, when you had this sort of very excitable individual, Misha Saakashvili, who was the leader of Georgia, who'd been encouraged to think by Bruce Jackson, among other people, that Georgia could get into NATO.
Dick Cheney, too, was a big enthusiast for this as well. Yeah,
exactly. And Dick Cheney, particularly. And actually, at that point, he therefore deliberately set out to provoke Russia. And that thing is completely sort of forgotten largely today. People just remember that it was Saakashvili was trying to provoke Russia by moving into South Ossetia, which was, at least under Russian control, maybe reprehensibly, but certainly was the case. And he knew exactly what the Russian reaction would be, which was to very sharply counterattack. And he expected, or at least hoped, had been led to believe that by Cheney that maybe the US and NATO would intervene on his behalf. But here's the important distinction. Bush himself and Stephen Hadley, who was his national security advisor, went out of their way to tell Saakashvili, don't think we're going to start World War III on your behalf. And it was, he'd been deluded, the Georgian had been deluded into thinking they would. Jackson himself said to me, Misha was trying to flip us into a war. So the difference between then and now is, unfortunately, it makes George W. Bush look kind of smart, because he realized the pitfalls, and he went to great lengths, even these people who we rightly reviled at the time for the invasion of Iraq and all the rest and everything else that went on at that time. But at least they had the sense to see that, provoking Russia in an area of vital concern to Russia's security concerns was not a good idea. Whereas I'm not sure the present crowd in the administration, and certainly not in the Congress, get the point.
Bruce Jackson, the former Lockheed Martin executive and founder of the Committee to Expand NATO, gave you a very astute quote. He said to you, "Fuck Russia is a proud and long tradition in U.S. foreign policy. It doesn't go away overnight."
Yeah, how right he was. I mean, Bruce is a very smart person who understands how the system works. Yeah, that's right. And it's actually, I'm old enough, and I remember, 1991, 1992, and it really did seem, I would feel stupid now to think that I thought this way, that maybe it had all gone away and, okay, so they won the Cold War and maybe now we can stop, living on the precipice, blah, blah, blah. I should have known then, and I did sort of dawn on me not too long afterwards, this was not going to go away, that fuck Russia would be present. And of course, the other smart person I admire, at least for their smartness, if not for their behavior, is, again, I keep referring to him, Norm Augustine, the head of Lockheed, who predicted in 1991, when arms budgets were being cut, because after all, the war was over, he said the defense budget will start recovering in 1996. And actually, he was wrong by a year, but still pretty good. So they knew, that fuck Russia, and now added to which we now have fuck China too, would be along to save them. So it's and this is, I talk elsewhere in the book about how really the defense system is really, we should think of it as like this giant, virus or amoeba that exists only to sort of maintain its food supply and grow. which is, I think, is one way to look at and is borne out actually by the history of since this all began with the beginning of the Cold War.
It reminds me of what the scholar Richard Sakwa says about NATO, which is that basically NATO exists to manage the risks created by its own existence.
Oh, very good. Yeah, that's right. Whatever they've cobbled up various. That's certainly it. I mean, the sort of hackneyed quote is, made by some British official, I think years ago, was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. But now you have the interesting fact that the Germans, want no part of the risks that that NATO, that are being undertaken in the name of NATO at the moment.
Which reminds me, I don't know if you saw this, but as we're speaking, there was just an article in the New York Times that is very critical of Germany's reluctance to engage in a war with Russia or to threaten its energy supplies, which mostly come from Russia. And the Times writes this, that there is now a, quote, wrenching debate over where precisely German loyalties lie.
I mean, I hate the cliche, you couldn't make this up. But, the Times, I mean, we could subject for another day maybe, but, how much worse even than could have been imagined the New York Times has become. And the notion that Germany should really just trample on its own very vital security interests, such as its energy supply, plus its, all its business relationships with Eastern Europe and so forth, with Russia, should therefore shoot itself in both feet by joining in this hysterical onslaught against Russia. It's amazing, really, that human hands could type such tripe, as someone said, but they manage it. The war, I think it's, again, we can discuss why there's really a total absence. I mean, maybe you scrutinize these things more closely than I do, but I've yet to see in any major news outlet, any questioning, any examination of the facts, any analysis of Ukrainian politics, why, which has led to all this, why any of this is happening. It's just this sort of hysteria. It's like, I don't know, it's like, takes us back to 1914 and stories of Germans bayoneting Belgian babies or something. It's that level of sort of puerile warmongering.
And I think that observation applies to Congress as well. In recent years, I think one could count on someone like Dennis Kucinich or Tulsi Gabbard to, at least be somewhat skeptical of this rush to send more weapons to Ukraine. Now you have Democrats pushing through this new Defending Ukraine Sovereignty Act of 2022, $500 million more at least for weapons deliveries to Ukraine. And there's just there's no congressional opposition from the progressive wing that I can see.
None whatsoever. I mean, they're too terrified of being labeled as soft on Putin or whatever he meant. And there's not even on the Republican, for a time in the sort of later Iraq years, we had, there was elements on the Republican right. I mean, I remember with affection Walter Jones, who was a Republican congressman from North Carolina, who was, we used to laugh at because he'd come up with the idea of calling French fries freedom fries. But then Jones, he started to, because Camp Lejeune was in his district, and once that we'd invaded Iraq, he found himself going to funerals of young Marines. And he had this Damascene moment when he realized that he was guilty. He was a guilty party, that he'd voted for all this and spent the rest of his life in Congress fighting against the wars, voting against them, and sending a personal letter of condolence and apology to the family of anyone killed in the wars. No, I don't think there's anyone left like that. Justin Amash, another one, a sort of libertarian Republican from Michigan. He used to be there, quite a strenuous anti-war voice. He's gone. So we have, as you say, a Congress that's completely supine in the face of the arms lobby. I don't know why we call them defense lobby. Let's call them what they are. They're the arms lobby.
There's a new article in Foreign Policy by two analysts with the RAND Corporation, a Pentagon-tied think tank. And they point out that, look, even if you forget the moral issue and the questions of international law and the question of should the U.S. be involved in Ukraine the way that it is, they point out that from a strictly military point of view, that tactically, this flood of U.S. weapons into Ukraine will make no difference on the actual war in the Donbass beyond prolonging it, because no matter how many weapons the U.S. pours in, Russia has such an overwhelming advantage just strictly because of geography, where it's located. Ukraine's on Russia's border. It's not on the U.S. border. So the U.S. cannot alter really the course of a war there with pouring in weapons, but yet they continue anyway. And I guess the question is, why do they continue to come in? And I'm wondering if you could talk about that and just the broader issue of U.S. military expenditures, that even if you put aside the moral dimension, whether we should be spending money on weapons of war instead of paying teachers or giving kids food, just the question of how easy it is to spend money on war that even from a military point of view makes no sense, makes no quote unquote strategic sense.
Well, that's a fundamental point. I mean, if I first talk about the second point question you asked, excuse me, is how little of our defense has to do with defense. I mean, when I talk to sort of, pro-defense, groups or outlets, I say, well, you really got to understand that you're being had, because, the objective in the whole defense system is not defense. If it was, they'd be actually taking care, for instance, they'd be to test weapons adequately. And yet the services are putting up a tremendous fight to gut. In the reform move, defense reform movement of the 1980s, the great victory was the creation of an office called the Director of the Office of Operational DOT and Operational Testing, which was an independent office, supposedly independent office, to test weapons before they're put into production. And the services fight with might and main every year to gut this. I mean, this year they've quite succeeded in the last budget, the last cycle, they managed to get a provision through saying they should be able to classify, or at least it was called classified but sensitive or something. Anyway, to stop us reading the results of their reports and so forth every year. So, that's just one example that, they were, useless boondoggles like the F-35, which everyone knows is useless. I mean, even the truncated kind of testing that goes on has shown it to be useless. The Navy version, the F-35C, I think certainly at one point last year had a 7% readiness rate, i.e. only 7 out of every 100 planes could actually fly and properly perform their missions. So the fact that the services work so hard, but so oriented to keeping the money flow, but not to sort of maintain themselves put themselves in a state of operational efficiency, shows where their priorities lie. So that is really the point. That's the fundamental point, that it's really, it's all about the money. And, at various times, in the days when we had a draft and a huge number of people, at least men, had passed through the military, passed through the army, everyone kind of knew that. Everyone knew what a sort of mostly useless, greed-driven bureaucracy it was. Now, unfortunately, because we have this very sort of isolated, in terms of society at large, military sector, you don't. I always say, if you walk around Washington, you almost never see anyone in uniform. The closest you get to realizing what a sort of military city it is, in reality, is around the Pentagon you see all these people with sort of very trim young people with short haircuts jogging. I mean, otherwise, inside the Pentagon, of course, they all wear combat suits, which is kind of ludicrous. I mean, they don't wear sort of proper full dress uniforms. They wear, like they're camouflage, like they just come in from the field and are heading for the front, which is kind of I always find quite amusing sort of fantasy world they live in. But so we, people at large, there's been such a sustained propaganda effort over recent decades to sort of present this sort of fantasy view of the military, and of which very few people have direct experience, that people don't realize to what degree, as I say, it's a giant confidence trick, pretending to be a sort of a sensible, sorely needed effort to defend us against our enemies, when in fact it's nothing of the kind.
Speaking of tricks, I want to ask you about Joe Biden's policy on Yemen, because he campaigned on ending support for the Saudi war in Yemen. He came into office and he announced that he will no longer be providing support for offensive operations to Saudi Arabia, but he will be providing some support to defensive operations. And what that's meant on the ground practically is more of the same. Just recently, as we're speaking, there was a new massacre by Saudi Arabia in a bombing of something like 70 civilians in Hodeidah. Saudi Arabia also knocked out the internet for the bulk of the country. I wonder if you talk about, how the weapons industry has profited from the Yemen war and Biden's trick in basically promising to end it, but coming in office and continuing it.
Yeah, if we needed reminding of Biden's role in the ongoing disaster, it's at that recent atrocity when 80 odd people were killed. Actually there was a piece of a bomb with it was clearly a Raytheon bomb, courtesy of the Raytheon Corporation. So. I looked at. I think in the book. In the book I talk about how closely, how integral the US is to the Saudi Arabian military. There's a small town outside of Riyadh called Eskan village, which it's 1,000 US service people and their families, together with their families, who are there to sell weapons. That's what they do. There's a sort of training thing somewhere in the job description, but and actually when I was writing about this, I looked up all the recent commanders. It's usually commanded by a two-star either usually Army, I think maybe sometimes an Air Force, I can't remember, but and every single one of them had then, when they left the military, they then set up a consultancy devoted to selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. So that the US, it's clearly established. I was certainly able to bring this out. The Saudi Air Force could not keep flying for a day, certainly not 2 days, without the large numbers of US contractors keeping the planes flying. They would run out of, it has to be a continual supply of munitions, of bombs and missiles and, from the US to Saudi Arabia, so they can go on bombing Yemen. So it's, the Biden, I don't think he cares that much about, extinguishing the Houthis or killing Yemenis, but this is a machine, it's impossible to stop. And certainly not worth investing any political capital in trying to stop it. So that even when, the Congress actually voted, I think the Senate voted by a majority to, cut off the supply of weapons to Saudi Arabia, this was essentially ignored by the administration who went on doing it. We can assume, that fuck Russia may be an important tradition in US foreign policy, but so is fuck Iran. So all the relevant lobby the Israelis have to do is to say, the Houthis are Iranian agents, which they have to a much greater degree when the war started. They have become, or much more closer to Iran. So that it's I'm not sure I'm answering your question clearly enough, but it's Biden, the idea of stopping weapon sales just because, or weapons deliveries, just because they're being used to massacre, large numbers of civilians and to destroy a society. It just doesn't even come on the radar for them in the White House, as far as I can see.
Let me ask you about a place where the guiding Washington imperatives of fuck Russia and fuck Iran actually converge, and that's Syria. You've done some reporting on the U.S. dirty war in Syria. When James Jeffrey, the former Trump envoy for Syria, was talking about it once, he said that his job in Syria was to create a quagmire for the Russians.
This isn't Afghanistan. This isn't Vietnam. This isn't a quagmire. My job is to make it a quagmire for the Russians.
And when I interviewed former Obama officials like Rob Malley and Robert Ford was the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, they agreed that a part of the guiding motive was to basically bleed Iran, because Iran did put a lot of resources into defending its ally, Bashar al-Assad. And so, by the way, did a former CIA official I interviewed named David McCloskey recently. Although they cited also the motives of bringing freedom, democracy, and all that stuff. But the budget on the CIA dirty war and how much the U.S. spent is still a mystery. The New York Times called it one of the costliest covert action programs in the history of the CIA. The Washington Post says the budget was approached $1 billion per year, or about $1 out of every $15 in the CIA's overall budget. And of course, these were for weapons that went to basically sectarian death squads in Syria and weren't directly given to al-Qaeda, but a lot of them did end up in the hands of al-Qaeda, known as al-Nusra. And that's what helped al-Nusra capture the province of Idlib, which it still occupies, creating what a current Biden official, Brett McGurk, calls al-Qaeda's largest safe haven since 9/11.
Look, Idlib province is the largest al-Qaeda safe haven since 9/11, tied directly to Ayman al-Zawahiri. This is a huge problem. I obviously will not talk about anything the U.S. government has done in certain parts of Syria on this problem, but the approach by some of our partners to send in tens of thousands of tons of weapons and looking the other way as these foreign fighters come into Syria may not have been the best approach. And al-Qaeda has taken full advantage of it.
I'm just wondering, in your years of reporting on the Syria dirty war, what strikes you about just how much money has been spent on it, and what's still not known about this program?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't know how much I believe all those figures. I mean, there was the vast. At one point, there was a huge early on for a Saudi-backed, allegedly Saudi-backed jihadi group. The CIA mounted this massive airlift from Croatia of weapons. I mean, it's the scale. They have these command centers in southern Turkey. I think it's not so much the CIA, also in Jordan. Maybe that's more the U.S. military. A massive effort. And the only thing it's the same notion. Again, it's a replay in a way of what went on in Afghanistan in the 1980s when the CIA was not only backing, was successfully engaged the Russians in a quagmire, but a point that they continually deny, but is certainly the case, that they concentrated their aid on the most extreme in Islamic terms, the most extreme jihadi groups in the Syrian insurgency against the communist government there. And I remember years ago, people who, Mujahideen commanders who were, could be called moderate, complaining bitterly how, the CIA deliberately gave it, directed the bulk of the aid to the to people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and to the most extreme things. So, and that we see that pattern exactly repeated in Syria, where they've gone out insofar as there was, the thing that was always being sort of reverently quoted in the New York Times, the democratic moderate Syrian resistance, or whatever name they gave it, were sidelined, where they were used sometimes they were used, al-Nusra, as I'm sure you know, would use them as a sort of front people through which the arms could be laundered so that they could, the American supplied arms. And, it's the fact that the CIA and the military and the whole U.S. government was engaged in really this monstrous war crime of not even expecting to win, but to keep to have a quagmire, as you say, is so just disgusting. It's just plain disgusting, and the fact that they've been able to enlist so much of the so much of the culture here and in Britain, particularly, in supporting this and cheering it on, and fomenting lies about chemical attacks and all the rest. I know you've documented that a lot. It's I really hope at least there'll come a time when people look back on and say, that was a crime. Not that I have much hope for any kind of Nuremberg type trial, I must say.
Yeah. I think John Kerry put it best when he admitted in a leaked recording, he was speaking to some Syrian opposition activists, that the U.S. was so determined to have regime change in Syria that they were even using ISIS as a tool for that not that they were directly supporting ISIS, but that they sat back and watched and basically let ISIS grow in Syria. And we're hoping that the growth of ISIS, including ISIS possibly taking Damascus, would induce Assad to negotiate his way out of power and be replaced by a leader favorable to U.S. interests. And Kerry said that that's why Russia came into the conflict in Syria, is because, in Kerry's words, Russia, quote, didn't want a Daesh government, did not want an ISIS government.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
What gave them that idea? I wonder if they, they probably told each other, yes, we're going to apply pressure and that will lead to Assad negotiating a democratic handover. I wonder if they may have said that to each other. The whole point, I think, was, for the CIA to have a major war, and the big selling point was, a quagmire for the Iranians, and they'd cobble together some kind of, threadbare rationale like the one Kerry quoted. I think they wanted, like the old World War I song, they were there because they were there because they were there. They wanted a war. The CIA, that's what it does. They this was an opportunity they could sell to the politicians. Great for the budget. I mean, there's something I talk about in the book. There's a little insight, which is in 2018, when Trump was sort of talked into mounting a brief sort of little mini surge in Afghanistan, and a source of mine was present at a meeting of senior four stars in the Pentagon, and they were discussing this. Word had just come down, and they said, well, they were agreed. He said they were in full agreement that this would be, it was complete in terms of making a difference in the war. This was completely pointless, but that it would do us good at budget time. And that was it. Fine. So we had the mini surge. A lot more people got killed, and then they went home again, and that was that. But that is it sounds sort of crude to almost to keep mentioning this, but that is the point. I mean, that's why they do these things. I think that's in the end why we had this. You have this slaughter in Syria, slaughter in Yemen, maybe soon to come, slaughter in Ukraine. For that reason, then they sort of slap on some sort of gimcrack strategic rationale, bleed Iran, force Assad to moderate his policies or something. But that's, almost, after the fact excuse.
Maybe this is a stretch, but is there a tie between the expansion of NATO for the benefit of the arms industry and the dirty war in Syria, in the sense that did expanding NATO make it easier for the CIA to use the former Soviet states to ship their weapons to Syria?
Well, yeah. I mean, they were getting a lot of weapons from Bulgaria. I don't know if you include Croatia, as I mentioned. Yes, I think, and as we know, the former Soviet states have been useful in other ways. They've been useful for places to go and torture people. That's pretty well documented.
One of the CIA torture sites is for sale right now, actually.
Say it again, sorry.
One of the former CIA torture sites has just been put up for sale. Private buyers can buy a former CIA torture site. Yeah.
So you could have a torture theme park or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. with CIA veterans sort of reenacting their proudest moments. Anything's possible in today's world. But yeah, I mean, to have in your camp in NATO a group of regimes, countries where there's been sort of acquaintanceship with democracy and all the rest. Rule of law has been a bit fractured in recent half century, with regime leaders that are desperate to be in the good graces of the Americans. Of course, that's entirely happy to ship weapons or to enable the cooperation with ISIS or whatever particular outrage is being contemplated.
Well, from the CIA dirty war in Syria, I want to go back to a CIA operation that you covered in the late 1980s. And I recently went back and revisited a documentary that you made with your wife, Leslie Cockburn, for PBS. It's called Guns, Drugs, and the CIA. And it's an investigation going around the world from Vietnam, Cambodia to Central America on the CIA's role in the international drug trade.
This is Frontline with Judy Woodruff.
Tonight's Frontline investigation traces the CIA's involvement with drug lords back to the agency's birth following World War II. It is a long history that asks this question. In the war on drugs, which side is the CIA on? Our program was produced by Leslie and Andrew Cockburn. It is called Guns, Drugs, and the CIA, and is reported by Leslie Cockburn.
And first of all, it's just a shocking documentary. And it's shocking now to look back and watch it and see PBS talk openly about the CIA's role in the international drug trade. And my impression in watching it, on top of just being stunned by the reporting you did and all the people you got on record to admit to their role in it, and high-level officials speaking about, overseeing or tacitly approving of drug operations. The fact that this was aired on PBS, I was watching and I was like, there's no way that this could be put on the air in a major US media outlet. Now, I'm wondering just to talk about how you made that documentary, what it was like to get it on air, and any reflections you have on it, more than 30 years later.
Well, yeah, it was, it was PBS Frontline, which in those days was under very different control. I mean, they were up for much more independent journalism than they seem to be today, independent or whatever the official ideology is. It grew out of really work that Leslie, my wife, had done actually for CBS, for CBS, on the dirty war in Nicaragua, where she'd come across evidence that clear evidence that the Contras were engaged in narcotics trafficking. So we were able to build on that, but then going back, we realized that, to tell the story properly, we had to go back to the Vietnam War and to the particular events that had happened in Laos, where, as people may or may not remember, there was a dirty war, a secret war fought by the CIA against the communists, against the North Vietnamese and the Laotian communists in northern Laos, enlisting this group of indigenous group called the Hmong people. And the Hmong had previously been used by the French in their war in Vietnam to the French intelligence had been engaged in the in shipment of in the opium trade, basically to help finance what they were doing. And the CIA really took that over. And our great success, I remember we went to northern Laos, or went to Thailand. You couldn't go to northern Laos at that time. We went to Thailand, just over the border from Laos, and found the guy who'd been the sort of military, the CIA's military commander with the Hmong. And there's a guy called Tony Poe, who was really, as someone, remember when I was looking for him and I was asking all his former colleagues in the CIA that I could talk to, I was saying, what was Tony Poe like? And to a man, they'd also say, oh, he was the guy Marlon Brando was trying to play in Apocalypse Now. And he actually looked like him even. And he was a sort of, as someone else described him, as an amiable psychopath, which is also a correct description. But he admitted it's the only time, that's why I'm so proud of this film, it's the only time that any actual former CIA official has admitted on camera, which he did to Leslie, that the CIA had been flying their local warlords, in this case, their local warlords, heroin.
Oh, he's making millions, because he had his own source of avenue for his own heroin.
What did he do with the money?
Well, what do you mean? U.S. bank accounts, Switzerland, wherever.
Didn't they know when Bang Pao said, I want some aircraft? Didn't they know what he wanted that for?
I'm sure we all knew it, what was going to, but we tried to monitor it because we control most of the pilots, you see. We're giving him a freedom of navigation into Thailand, in the bases. And we don't want him to get involved in moving, this illicit traffic. Okay, silver bars and gold, okay, but not heroin. What they would do is they weren't going into Thailand, they were flying it in a big wet wing airplane. It could fly for 13 hours, a DC-3, and all the wings were filled with gas. They fly down to Pak Se, then they fly over to Da Nang, and then the number 2 guy, the President 2, would receive it.
They provided the airplane, and they were, so he could fly his heroin to market at a time when, several US GIs a day were dying of overdoses in Vietnam. And, there were other people who'd been associated. I remember talking to former Air America, which was the CIA's private airline, pilots, and one of whom we put on camera. Neil Hansen, who for reasons I never discovered was known as Weird Neil. And he was in jail because he'd gone in, he'd become a drug pilot for the cartels. But he said, I remember his great line. He said, I flew the sticky bricks. So they were all in on it. And this was not a new revelation. There was Alfred McCoy's great book, Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. But no one before, until we came along, and I say this in all, lack of humility, had actually gotten these people to talk. There was the pilot, there was a USAID guy, Ron Rickenbach, who described, he said, yes, I remember seeing all the opium lined up in the crates on the side of the runway being loaded onto the Air America planes.
And I was on the airstrip. That was my job, to move in and about and to go from place to place. And my people were in charge of dispatching aircraft. I was in the areas where opium was transshipped. I personally was a witness to opium being placed on aircraft, American aircraft. I witnessed it being taken off smaller aircraft that were coming in from outlying sites.
Yes, I've seen the sticky bricks come on board, and no one was challenging their right to carry it. It was their own property.
Neil Hansen is a former senior Air America pilot, now serving a sentence for smuggling cocaine.
We were some sort of a freebie airline in some respects there. Whoever the customer or the local representative put on the airplane, we flew. Primarily, it was transported on our smaller aircraft, the Helios, the Porters, and the things like that would visit the little outlying villages. They would send their opium to market.
I mean, it was well known to hundreds, if not thousands of people who'd mentioned, who'd all, but nevertheless, the official truth had been denied for decade after decade. And anyone who said, oh, the CIA was, involved in the drug trade in Southeast Asia got dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. And then we find the same thing going on in Central America during the Contra War.
Are you aware of whether or not narcotics proceeds at some time may or may not have supported Contra efforts?
Yes, sir. Narcotics proceeds were used to shore up the Contra effort.
Did you personally play a role in some of the transfer of that money?
Yes, I did.
In 1984, when Congress cut off Contra funding, the White House turned to other sources for support. According to documents, Ramon Milian Rodriguez had been laundering foreign payments for the CIA up through 1982, at the same time as he was laundering cash for the cocaine cartel. He says the CIA turned to him again.
To have people like me in place that can be used is marvelous for them. The agency, and quite rightly so, has things that they have to do which they can never admit to an oversight committee, right? And the only way they can fund these things is through drug money or through illicit money that they can get their hands on in some way.
So we have a pattern, going back to what we've been talking about earlier, that the agency and the U.S. covert state, the covert operations side of the U.S. government, continually engages in an ongoing alliance with the most extreme, terrorist-inclined jihadis. That seems to be a very, recurring feature, and is also engaged in the drug trade. I don't know if there's much aspect of the drug trade in Ukraine, but if there was, I'm sure we'd be involved in it.
Well, Andrew Cockburn, I really appreciate your time. Andrew Cockburn is the Washington editor of Harper's Magazine. His most recent book is The Spoils of War. Andrew, thanks a lot.
Hey, a pleasure. Thank you.